Since the release of these chilling images from the night of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, authorities say tips have been pouring in.
How often is video a breakthrough for investigators?
There is video everywhere.
Her body was found. After 63 days of silence, after 63 days of search teams combing desert terrain, after 63 days of helicopters and tips and unanswered questions, Nancy Guthrie was found. And the moment investigators confirmed what they had recovered, everything this case had been building toward collapsed into a single name. Tommaso. Before anything else, subscribe right now. Because in this video, everything changes. 63 days. That is how long this case stayed open. That is how long an 84-year-old woman remained missing while her family stood in front of cameras and her community held its breath. 63 days of questions that circled the same person, the same timeline, the same 41-minute window that investigators had been studying since February 1st, 2026. And now, those questions have answers. Nancy Guthrie did not wander. She did not leave. She did not disappear into the night by accident or confusion or circumstance. She was taken from the home she had lived in for years. The home she knew. The home someone else knew just as well. Her name was Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old. A woman who lived quietly in the Catalina foothills of Tucson, Arizona. A neighborhood where the streets are familiar, where residents notice things, where life moves on a predictable rhythm. She had a pacemaker. That device was not optional. It was the difference between her heart functioning and not. She needed her medication. She needed her health items. She needed all of it to stay alive. None of it left with her that night. Think about that for a moment.
24 minutes after the hour, there are new developments in the mysterious disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. News Nation has just learned that photos from all 3 security cameras at her home have been recovered. While authorities say nothing of note has been found so far, investigators are taking a closer look at the security gate on the door.
Whoever removed Nancy Guthrie from that home on the night of February 1st, 2026, left her survival tools behind deliberately. That was not an oversight. That was a decision. And decisions have owners. The last confirmed person to see Nancy Guthrie alive was her son-in-law, Tommaso. He drove her home that night from her daughter Annie's house, where the two of them had spent the evening together. A routine visit. Dinner. Conversation. Nothing that raised any visible alarm from the outside. By all accounts, it felt like any other night. He dropped her off. He said he waited to see her enter safely. He watched the garage door open. He watched her go inside. And then he left. That was the last time anyone confirmed seeing Nancy Guthrie alive.
Brian, this is still so troubling. Have we heard anything more from the family?
No, we haven't heard much. I mean, Savannah Guthrie hasn't released another video. She's obviously back in New York City now. She hasn't been back on the Today Show, but she hasn't been in Arizona from what I've been told.
Hi viewers. Here is a question, and the answer matters. Did you believe Tommaso was involved from the very beginning of this case, or did something specific change your mind along the way? Drop your answer in the comments right now. Because this case did not start with certainty. It started with silence. And in missing persons investigations, silence from the people closest to the victim is never neutral. It is data. And Tommaso's silence was the first data point that made investigators look twice. He made no public statement. He did not appear in front of cameras asking for help finding his mother-in-law. He did not do what people instinctively do when someone they love vanishes without explanation. He covered part of his face leaving his home. Annie stayed close beside him, visibly shaken. But Tommaso? Tommaso looked like a man managing a situation. Not grieving one. That distinction is small. But in investigations, small distinctions are everything. Now here is where the story of Nancy Guthrie stops being a missing persons case and becomes something far more calculated. Far more deliberate. Far more difficult to look away from. February 1st, 2026. Tucson, Arizona. Catalina Foothills. The kind of neighborhood where porches are lit and driveways are familiar and a car that doesn't belong gets noticed. Nancy had lived there for years. She knew her home. She knew her routine. And someone else had spent weeks learning both. At 1:47 in the morning, Nancy's doorbell camera went offline.
Video surveillance has become a critical element for law enforcement in helping solve crimes.
Images the FBI recovered from Nancy Guthrie's Google Nest doorbell camera, providing critical clues.
Using the rim of the arch along with the tiles, experts will be able to get his height, weight, and shoe size almost exactly.
Not because of a power failure. Not because of a technical glitch. Because someone accessed it remotely using the correct credentials. The right login. The right password. The right knowledge of exactly how that system worked. Stop there. This was not a break-in. This was not someone guessing. Whoever disabled that camera already knew how. They had been inside that system before. They belonged to it. Or at least, they had been given access by someone who did. And then, at 2:28 in the morning, Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker transmitted its final signal. 41 minutes. That is the window. From the moment that camera went dark to the moment that pacemaker went silent, 41 minutes passed. 41 minutes in which no alarm was triggered, no neighbor heard anything, no digital system recorded another trace of Nancy Guthrie moving through her own home. That is not chaos. That is control. When investigators entered the home, they were not looking for disorder. They were looking for consistency. Does this scene match what a normal night should look like? And the answer was no. But not in the way people expect. There were no broken windows. No forced locks. No visible signs of a rapid struggle. What was missing was Nancy. And what remained told a story of someone who had moved through that space without needing to force anything. Because they already knew how to get in. They already knew what was inside. They already knew exactly how much time they had. Her medication sat untouched. Her health devices stayed behind. The things she could not live without were left exactly where they were. And that single detail, that one unbearable detail, is what told investigators everything they needed to know about intent. This was not impulsive. This was not a moment of rage. This was planned. This was carried out with precision. And at the center of that precision was a motive that investigators had begun building a case around before Nancy's body was even recovered. Greed. Not anger. Not conflict. Not passion. Greed. The oldest and most patient motive there is. The kind that does not act in the moment. The kind that waits. The kind that plans. The kind that shows up on January 11th wearing a mask just to see what happens when someone knocks on an 84-year-old woman's door at an unusual hour. The kind that comes back on January 24th to confirm what it already knows. The kind that drives a woman home on February 1st, watches her go inside, and then does not go home itself. Nancy Guthrie's body has been found. And the case that began with one question, where is she, has now become a different question entirely. One that cuts straight to the heart of what happened inside that house during those 41 minutes. One that points directly at the person who was the last to see her alive, who knew her home, who knew her camera system, who knew her routine, and who had every reason in the world to want her gone. That question is not where is Nancy Guthrie anymore. That question is how did Tommaso think he would ever get away with it? January 11th, 2026. 3 weeks before Nancy Guthrie disappeared. A figure appeared at her front door. Masked. Unhurried. Not forcing entry. Not attempting to get inside. Just standing there. Present. Watching. And then leaving. That detail was not released to the public immediately. Investigators held it close because they understood what it meant. And what it meant was not random. What it meant was that whoever stood at Nancy Guthrie's front door on January 11th did not come to act. They came to observe. They came to learn. They came to confirm what they already suspected about her routine, her response time, her environment, and how much the neighborhood noticed. That visit was not the beginning of a crime. It was the beginning of a plan. Think about that.
In Tucson, investigators faced a huge challenge trying to recover video from Nancy Guthrie's Nest camera that had been disconnected from the home's Wi-Fi. Officials were eventually able to access the footage through back-end systems.
Weeks before February 1st, someone already knew where Nancy lived. Someone already knew her address, her home's layout, the placement of her camera, the rhythm of her street. And instead of acting immediately, they pulled back. They waited. They watched. Because patience is not innocence. Patience, in this context, is preparation. Now move forward. January 24th. Another flag date. Another point on a timeline that investigators had identified long before the public understood why those dates mattered. The family themselves asked the public to focus on it. Not January 31st. Not February 1st specifically. January 24th. A date that sits almost perfectly between the first appearance and the night Nancy vanished. That is not coincidence. That is sequencing. And Tommaso sat at the center of every single sequence. He was not a stranger to that home. He was family. He had stood in that kitchen, moved through those hallways, sat in those rooms. He knew where things were kept. He knew the layout not because he had studied it from the outside, but because he had been invited inside. And that access, that trusted, intimate access, is what made him the most dangerous person connected to Nancy Guthrie. Not a stranger with unknown motives. A familiar face with a hidden one. Now consider the camera. Nancy's doorbell system was not a simple device. It required login credentials to access remotely. A password. A username. A level of familiarity with the system itself. Investigators confirmed it was not breached. It was not hacked. It was accessed. Correctly. By someone who already knew how. Who has that kind of knowledge about an 84-year-old woman's home security system? Not a stranger. Not someone passing through. Someone who belonged there. Someone who had been shown, or had learned, or had quietly paid attention over time to exactly how that system worked and what it would take to make it go dark without triggering anything else. That is not a small detail. That is the detail that changes the entire shape of this case. And it connects directly to something else investigators were building in parallel. The nearby rental property. A home close to Nancy's residence in the Catalina Foothills. Investigators focused on it not because it was obviously connected, but because of what it provided. Cover. A reason to exist in that space. A vehicle parked nearby does not stand out if someone lives nearby. A person moving at unusual hours does not draw attention if they appear to belong to the neighborhood. Two competing timelines surrounded that property. One version placed its occupants leaving before February 1st. Another suggested they left immediately after. Both versions could not be true. But both versions pointed to the same thing. That property created a window of invisibility. And in a neighborhood like Catalina Foothills, invisibility does not happen by accident. Then there was the construction activity in the same area. Equipment. Workers. Vehicles moving at different hours. All of it creating environmental noise, the kind of noise that allows unusual movement to blend into the background. Investigators looked at both elements together because together they answered a question that had been sitting at the edge of the case since the beginning. How does someone operate in a high-visibility neighborhood without being seen? The answer was by appearing to belong. And Tommaso already belonged. He did not need cover. He had something better. He had legitimacy. He had a reason to be there that no one would question. He was family. He was trusted. He was the man who drove Nancy home that night and waited, by his own account, to make sure she got inside safely. That image. That version of events. That is what he offered investigators. A concerned son-in-law making sure an elderly woman got home without incident. But the timeline does not support that image.
And typically when it comes to doorbell cameras, those are placed 4 feet up. But if you have flexibility with your camera system, experts recommend doing 8 to 10 feet up. That's high enough where it's out of easy reach from a criminal, but low enough to get those really fine details if someone were to come into the home. As for Nancy Guthrie's disconnected camera, authorities at last check.
Not fully, because the camera went offline at 1:47 in the morning. And Tommaso was the last person to see Nancy alive. And the pacemaker went silent 41 minutes later. And none of her health items left with her. And the DNA recovered from that scene was not clean. And the cell tower data told a story that a single conversation could not undo. By January 24th, investigators now believe the decision had already been made. The date was chosen. The method was understood. The access was confirmed. Everything that would happen on February 1st had already been rehearsed, mapped, and settled. The only thing left was the execution. And Tommaso was already behind the wheel. 41 minutes. That number does not leave this case. It sits at the center of everything. From 1:47 in the morning to 2:28 in the morning, 41 minutes passed inside Nancy Guthrie's home in the Catalina foothills of Tucson, Arizona. And in those 41 minutes, everything that investigators had spent weeks building their case around came to its conclusion. Start at 1:47. The camera goes dark. Not from a power surge. Not from a system failure. From a deliberate action taken by someone who accessed it remotely using the correct credentials. The house, from a digital standpoint, goes blind. No recording. No motion detection. No alert sent to any connected device. Just silence. Now the house is dark. And Nancy is inside. There was no forced entry. Investigators confirmed that early. The lock showed no stress. The door frames were intact. The windows were undisturbed. Which means whoever entered that home after 1:47 in the morning did not need to break anything to get inside. They already had a way in. Whether that was a key, a code, or access that had been arranged in advance, the point remains the same. They belonged there. Or they had made sure they could enter as if they did. Think about what that means for Nancy. She was 84 years old. She was home. She had no reason to expect anything other than the end of a normal evening. Her daughter's house had been warm and familiar. The drive home had been quiet. Her son-in-law had waited to see her go inside. Everything, from her perspective, had followed the shape of an ordinary night. And then the camera went dark. And someone came through that door. No alarm was raised. No neighbor heard anything that caused them to look twice. The street outside stayed quiet. The neighborhood stayed still. Whatever happened inside that house during those 41 minutes, it happened without disrupting the world outside those walls. That level of quiet is not accidental. It is the result of preparation. Of knowing exactly how to move, how to act, how to ensure that nothing spills outward. And that kind of operational control does not come from impulse. It comes from planning. From rehearsal. From having already walked through the steps in your mind so many times that when the moment arrives, there is no hesitation. Her medication stayed behind. Her pacemaker had been transmitting cardiac data consistently until it stopped. Her health devices, the ones she could not function without, were left in the home. Deliberately. Because the person who came through that door that night did not intend for Nancy Guthrie to need them again. At 2:28 in the morning, the pacemaker transmitted its final signal. 41 minutes. That is all this took. And investigators said something that stayed long after the technical details faded. The most chilling part of this timeline was not what the forensic evidence suggested. It was the silence. The complete, unbroken silence of a neighborhood that noticed nothing while inside one of its homes, an 84-year-old woman's life came to an end. Nancy trusted the person who came through that door. That is the only explanation that fits the absence of noise, the absence of a struggle that reached outside those walls, the absence of any alarm raised in those 41 minutes. She was not confronted by a stranger whose presence would have immediately caused her to react. She was confronted by someone whose face she recognized. Someone her instincts had not yet learned to be afraid of. Now look at the DNA. When investigators processed the interior of that home, they recovered biological material. Not in one location. In multiple places. And the sample was not clean. It was mixed, meaning more than one contributor. And that complexity is exactly why forensic teams moved carefully. Because separating a mixed DNA profile is not fast. It is precise. It is methodical. And it matters because a single confirmed match does not suggest someone was there. It places them there. Definitively. Physically. Without argument. And in Nancy Guthrie's home, that placement was going to tell investigators exactly who had been inside during a window when no one was supposed to be there. The cell tower data moved in the same direction. Devices that appeared near the Catalina foothills on January 11th appeared again on January 24th. And those same devices showed behavioral changes on the night of February 1st. Not absence. Interruption. Phones do not vanish from cell networks without reason. They are switched off, moved deliberately, or physically removed from the area. And when that interruption aligns with a 41-minute window in which a woman's pacemaker stops transmitting, it stops being a coincidence. It becomes a pattern. And patterns do not lie. Now follow the movement. Devices that had been positioned near Nancy's home on the night of February 1st began moving away from the residential area after the critical window closed. Not randomly. In a direction. Away from the Catalina foothills. Away from the neighborhood. Toward terrain that was less visible, less populated, more remote. Toward the desert. That movement was noted. That direction was logged. And it became the thread investigators followed when the question shifted from what happened inside that house to where Nancy Guthrie had been taken afterward. 41 minutes changed everything. And the evidence left inside those 41 minutes was about to change everything again. Because the DNA profiles were almost separated. The cell data was almost fully mapped. And the desert, which someone believed would keep a secret, was already being searched. Greed is a patient motive. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive with anger or visible emotion or the kind of behavior that makes people uncomfortable in the moment. It moves quietly. It plans. It waits. And it wears the face of someone you trust completely. That is what made Tommaso Sion's motive so difficult to see at first. Because from the outside, he looked like family. He looked like a son-in-law who had driven his elderly mother-in-law home and made sure she got inside safely. He looked like a man whose wife was devastated by her mother's disappearance. He looked like someone on the periphery of a tragedy, not the center of it. But investigators do not work from appearances. They work from evidence. And the evidence, layer by layer, was building a portrait of a man who had spent weeks calculating what Nancy Guthrie's death would mean for him financially. Nancy Guthrie was not a woman without means. The home she lived in one of Tucson's more established neighborhoods, represented significant value. Her estate, her assets, her financial standing, all of it carried weight. And weight, in the wrong hands, becomes motive. Investigators began examining the financial landscape around Tommaso and Annie early in the case. Not because finances automatically point to anything, but because in cases where there is no visible emotional motive, no documented conflict, no obvious trigger, money is always the question that follows. And what investigators found when they looked at that financial picture was not something they could dismiss. There was pressure. Not the kind that makes headlines. The quiet kind. The kind that builds over time and doesn't surface publicly until something forces it into the open. And in this case, what forced it into the open was Nancy's disappearance and the investigative lens that came with it. Now recall Tommaso's behavior in the days after Nancy vanished. He said nothing publicly. Not a statement to the press. Not an emotional appeal for information. Not the kind of visible, vocal desperation that defines how most people respond when someone they love disappears without explanation. He covered his face leaving his home. He stayed close to Annie but remained emotionally unreadable in a way that investigators noted almost immediately. Behavior matters in missing persons investigations. It is not evidence on its own, but it is data. And data, when it aligns with everything else, becomes part of the structure. His behavior aligned. The cell tower data aligned. Devices consistent with his movement appearing on January 11th, appearing again on January 24th, appearing on February 1st near the Catalina Foothills. And then interrupting during the exact window in which Nancy's pacemaker went silent. The camera access aligned. Someone who knew the credentials. Someone who knew the system. Someone who had been inside that home enough times to understand exactly how it worked and what it would take to disable it without triggering an alert. The vehicle aligned. Seized early by law enforcement, not as proof, but because it was the last controlled environment connected to Nancy's physical movement. Vehicles hold data that people cannot erase with memory or explanation. Trace material. Transfer patterns. Biological evidence that does not disappear simply because time passes. And the rental property aligned. A nearby location that created environmental cover in a neighborhood where unfamiliar presence gets noticed. A location that investigators kept returning to because its timeline kept conflicting with itself. Every single piece pointed in the same direction. And at the center of that direction was one name. One person who appeared at every intersection of evidence, timeline, access, and motive. Tommaso. The public had been watching this case for weeks. They had watched the family ask for help. They had watched search teams move through open land. They had watched journalists report on investigative theories and source-based claims and the slow, grinding machinery of a case that refused to resolve quickly. And through all of it, one question had stayed constant. Why was someone with no confirmed alibi, with confirmed access to the home, with confirmed knowledge of the camera system, with a financial motive and a behavioral pattern that investigators noted immediately, still not in handcuffs? The answer was because investigators were not building a story. They were building a case. And those two things are not the same. A story can be told with pieces. A case has to hold against every challenge, every defense, every argument that a courtroom will raise. And that requires patience. It requires confirmation. It requires the kind of forensic certainty that cannot be dismantled. That certainty was coming. The DNA profiles were separating. The cell data was mapping. The desert was being searched. And the financial evidence was being documented in a way that would survive scrutiny. Greed had set this in motion. And greed was about to become the foundation of everything that followed. Because someone had looked at an 84-year-old woman, a woman who trusted him, a woman whose daughter loved him, a woman who had no reason in the world to fear him, and had seen an inheritance. A transaction. An obstacle between himself and what he believed he was owed. And that calculation was about to cost him everything. The desert does not give up what it holds easily. That is something investigators understood from the beginning. The terrain around the Catalina foothills, the open land that stretches beyond the residential edges of Tucson, is vast. It is remote in ways that do not show up on a street map. And for someone who needed a place where a secret could stay hidden, it would have seemed, in the moment of choosing it, like the right answer. But the desert had already been narrowed. Not through guesswork. Through data. The cell movement patterns had established a direction. Devices that interrupted during the 41-minute window had resumed signal afterward and moved. That movement was logged, mapped, and translated into a geographic corridor that search teams began working through with precision. Not a wide, open sweep. A focused, data-guided progression through terrain that had been selected based on what the evidence suggested was possible within the time window available. Because time matters even after the fact. How far could someone travel from the Catalina foothills in the hours before dawn on February 2nd? What routes were available? What areas offered the kind of concealment that someone would look for if they needed to move quickly and leave no visible trace in an established neighborhood? Those questions are not theoretical. They are mathematical. And the mathematics led investigators to a location. A specific location. Remote enough that it had not been covered in the early, wide-ranging searches. Close enough to the established movement corridor that when investigators arrived there with the evidence already built around it, what they found confirmed what the data had been suggesting for weeks. Nancy Guthrie was found. When that confirmation came, it did not arrive with the noise that people might expect from a breakthrough moment. It arrived quietly, the way most significant investigative developments do. A location identified. A team deployed. A discovery made. And then, inside the investigation, everything shifted at once because the case had just moved from missing persons to something else entirely. And that shift came with a different weight, a different set of legal standards, a different level of evidentiary requirement. And investigators were ready. Because they had not been waiting for the discovery to start building their case. They had been building it for weeks. The discovery was the confirmation. Not the beginning. The forensic work that followed the recovery of Nancy's remains was handled with the same precision that had defined every step of this investigation after the federal layer became involved. Because the early days of this case had carried a vulnerability that one investigative source had already flagged publicly. The supervisor who first responded to Nancy's home had never investigated a case of this nature before. That inexperience, in the most critical early hours, may have allowed certain things to move more slowly than they should have. But the federal involvement that came afterward changed the entire architecture of the investigation. And by the time Nancy was found, the case being built around her disappearance and the person responsible for it was not fragile. It was structured. It was documented. It was ready. The DNA profiles had been fully separated. And one of those profiles had no legitimate reason to be present in Nancy Guthrie's home during the window between 1:47 and 2:28 in the morning on February 1, 2026. That profile was matched. And the match closed the distance between suspicion and confirmation in a way that nothing else in the case could. Tommaso was taken into custody. Not as a person of interest. Not for questioning. As the individual investigators had determined, through weeks of forensic work, digital analysis, financial documentation, and behavioral evidence, was responsible for what happened to Nancy Guthrie during those 41 minutes inside her home. Annie, Nancy's daughter, Tommaso's wife, was left in a position that cannot be easily described. The investigation had publicly cleared her through interviews, forensic comparison, and a review of evidence that did not place her inside the timeline of what happened that night. But cleared of involvement is not the same as unburdened. She had lost her mother. And she had lost the version of her life that she had believed to be real. Both at once. In the same moment. That is a weight that no investigative clearing can remove. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She had lived in the Catalina foothills for years. She had built a life in a home that was familiar to her, in a neighborhood that noticed things, surrounded by people who, when she disappeared, immediately felt that something was wrong. She was not a headline. She was a person. She was a mother. She was a woman whose final evening had been spent having dinner with her daughter in a moment that felt like any other ordinary night. She did not deserve what followed that night. And the man who decided that her life was worth less than what he believed he stood to gain from her death is now answering for the decision in the only place where that answer carries real consequence. If you have any information about this case, any detail at all, no matter how small it may seem, this is the moment to come forward. Call the FBI directly. 1-800-CALL-FBI. That number is 1-800-225-5324. You can also submit a tip online at tips.fbi.gov. There is a total reward of $1,100,000. $1 million from Nancy's family and an additional $100,000 from the FBI. You can remain completely anonymous. You do not need to be certain. You do not need to have all the answers. Investigators build the case. You provide the detail. Because in cases like this, a single detail can change everything. Nancy Guthrie is not a headline. She never was. And this case, even with an arrest, is not fully closed. Because courts will now take what investigators built and test every piece of it. And there are details inside this case, details about the financial evidence, the full scope of what was planned, and what investigators found inside that vehicle that have not yet been made public. In the next video, those details come forward, including one piece of evidence recovered from Tommaso's vehicle that investigators described as the element that removed every remaining doubt. It is the detail that made the arrest possible. And it is the detail that changes how every earlier moment in this case is understood. Do not miss that video. Because once you hear what was found, you will not be able to look at any part of this timeline the same way again.